The early 90s was a magical time for a lot of wrestling fans. Saturday night's main event, Hasbro figures, Coliseum video rentals and Hulkamania. But for all the nostalgia, it was also an era where the company started to get a bit silly. On the gimmick front, you had the likes of the Mountie, Tugboat and the Genius, all mildly ridiculous, but we were still fond of them in their own way. But the gimmicks we're looking at today weren't just ridiculous, they were downright terrible. Battle Cat was one of those early 90s gimmicks that almost felt like a dream until you actually go back and watch it. Yes, it was a man dressed like a cat, or perhaps he was supposed to be a super cat or a cat-inspired superhero. It was never properly clarified. When he debuted in October 1990, there wasn't any real build-up. He just appeared like a stray who'd wandered in off the street. But there was a reason that the gimmick existed, and it wasn't quite as random as it looked. The man under the mask was Brady Boone, who was a gifted high-flying wrestler who'd spent time working in Japan, and while he was over there, he saw up close how the Tiger Mask character worked. It was a full superhero-style persona built around speed and agility. Tiger Mask was a sensation in Japan and the fans loved him, and Battle Cat was the WWF's attempt at copying that formula. And to be fair to him, he did have the mannerisms down, but this just all felt really silly. You half expected him to start pissing all over the ring to mark his territory. I mean, Tiger Mask was cool, but there's a big difference between a majestic tiger and a domesticated cat, and the costume itself didn't help things either. The mask looked like it was from a discount costume shop. After only a handful of matches, Brady Boone was released from the company for reasons that were never made public. But the gimmick didn't disappear. It was handed over to a man named Bob Bradley. Bradley had previously wrestled as the Catman, which was a prototype of Battle Cat, but surprisingly, that didn't make him a very good replacement. He just couldn't do the high-flying stuff, and so Battle Cat was neutered. The reactions from the fans to the character was almost non-existent. The crowds didn't boo him, but they didn't cheer him either. Every time he would hit a flip or a dive, he would get a polite response from them. But Battle Cat just didn't connect with them, and he certainly wasn't going to steal any fans from Tiger Mask. In total, BK got into roughly 10 cat fights in his career, and then he was never seen again. Maybe he fell off a roof or something. The Berzerker was one of the most bizarre characters to walk into the WWF in the early 90s. He was a 6'6", 300-pound Viking who stumbled around the ring yelling, while swinging a sword and trying to throw opponents over the top rope. The character was presented as if he genuinely believed that he was from another century. John Nord was the wrestler who was playing the character, and he'd been in the business for years before arriving in the WWF. He'd wrestled as the Barbarian in Mid-South, as Nord the Barbarian in the AWA, and later as Yukon John, a lumberjack character. He was a very capable big man who was obviously used to playing this kind of role in other companies, and he was highly respected by the other wrestlers in the locker room. He should have had enough charisma to make this gimmick work, but for some reason it just didn't get over, and that's probably because it was utterly ridiculous. A Viking in 1991 didn't make a lot of sense to begin with, but the character went further by acting as if he genuinely didn't understand how professional wrestling worked, and that made booking the Berzerker quite a difficult task. He did have matches with the likes of Jimmy Snuka and Bret Hart, and he even had a memorable confrontation with The Undertaker, which included a moment where he tried to stab him with his actual sword, but none of it ever went anywhere. The fans just couldn't take this gimmick seriously. He was big and loud and visually very memorable, but that was about it. By 1993, the Berzerker had gone, perhaps off to Valhalla, and that was the end for John Nord too. Big Bully Busick was a character that looked like he'd walked straight out of an early 1900s black and white silent movie, and outside of that old-fashioned appearance, the gimmick came down to the fact that he was literally just a bully. He popped a kid's balloon with his cigar and antagonised ring announcer Mike McGurk, and of course he bullied and mocked his opponents during matches. Behind the gimmick was a man named Nicholas Busick. He'd been wrestling since the late 70s and worked for decades as a police officer. He'd invented the bully character himself in the Southern Territories based on the tough guys that he'd seen growing up in West Virginia. But when he got to the WWF, they totally flattened the gimmick and turned it into a two-dimensional character. He started off by beating a bunch of jobbers, but he quickly moved on to losing to the likes of Brett and Kerry Von Erich. He did have one lame feud with the Brooklyn Brawler over who the bigger bully was, but that's about it. The fans didn't buy this guy at all because it was such a silly gimmick. And backstage, it quickly became clear that the character wasn't going anywhere. He was originally scheduled to appear at the Survivor Series in 1991, but was replaced by Hercules before the show because he decided that he wanted to leave the company. And so the character disappeared from television, presumably off in his time machine back to the early 1900s. Saba Simba was one of the most tone-deaf gimmicks the WWF ever came up with. When Tony Atlas returned to the company at the end of 1990, they didn't bring him back as the former tag team champion that many people remembered. Instead, they repackaged him as an African tribal warrior, barefoot, carrying a big wooden shield and a spear, and wearing this huge feathered headdress. The whole idea was that he'd suddenly rediscovered his roots. On paper it was pitched as a heroic character, but in reality it leaned on every crude stereotype that they could think of. From the moment Saba Simba stepped onto WWF TV, the presentation was an over-the-top caricature. The WWF magazine tried to rationalise the character by claiming Atlas had watched a documentary on African culture and experienced some kind of personal awakening. To fully understand why Tony Atlas decided to take this gimmick, you have to understand where he was in his life at the time. In the late 70s and early 80s, he was a major star who'd made history when he and Rocky Johnson became the first black WWF Tag Team Champions. But by the middle of the decade, his push had come to an end, and by 1986, he'd left the company. The years that followed were brutal. Atlas fell into a drug addiction and lost his home, and ended up sleeping on a park bench in freezing temperatures. He later said that he was about an hour from freezing to death when he finally swallowed his pride and called Vince McMahon for help. McMahon offered him a job back on the roster, but it was on the condition that he'd come back as Saba Simba. He later said that he needed the job so badly that he was happy to take anything that he was offered, and he credits this job with literally saving his life. And he only ended up playing the role for a few months because it failed on every level. The idea that Tony Atlas had spontaneously become a tribal warrior after watching a documentary was ridiculous. He was meant to have a feud with Akeem, but he left the company around the same time that Simba debuted. Without that storyline, they had nothing else for him to do. He drifted into mid-card matches, usually on the losing end, and the crowd showed little interest. Critics later described it as one of the most racist gimmicks WWE has ever produced. Mark Henry said it was an embarrassment to black wrestlers. The character disappeared without any explanation after the 1991 Royal Rumble, and that is probably for the best. But it did save the life of Tony Atlas, so we can at least be grateful for that. Skinner was one of the WWF's most outlandish creations of the early 90s. He was a swamp-dwelling alligator hunter from the Florida Everglades who looked like he'd crawled straight out of a muddy riverbank. He had long scraggly hair, a filthy beard and a crocodile tooth necklace, and he always had that mouthful of chewing tobacco that he spat at his opponents. That was really black licorice, by the way. Before Skinner's debut, they aired videos of him wandering through swamps and snarling into the camera, threatening to skin wrestlers alive. But honestly, these videos ended up being the best part of the entire gimmick. It was based on the hillbillies from Deliverance, and he was designed to be dirty, threatening and repulsive, and to be fair, he managed to pull that off fantastically. But the presentation was everything, because when the bell rang, he was just another mid-card heel. Skinner was portrayed by Steve Cairn, and the contrast between the character and the man behind it couldn't have been bigger. In the 80s, Cairn was one half of the Fabulous Ones with Stan Lane, which was a flashy tag team modelled after the Chippendales. But by 1991, Cairn was looking for work, so he went for a meeting with Vince McMahon. He knew that Vince was into hunting, so he showed up with a bunch of alligator skins from a recent trip to Florida, hoping that it might spark some interest. And incredibly, it did have the desired effect, because Vince offered him a job in this gimmick. But the fans didn't take to the gimmick at all. After the initial disgust of seeing him spit the tobacco in people's faces, the fans were not interested in what Skinner was selling. Once it was clear that the character wasn't catching on, he got stuck in the middle of the card with no real direction, and by 1993, he just disappeared entirely. Damien Demento is one of those gimmicks where you watch it now and wonder what drugs they must have been taking backstage. He was billed as being from the outer reaches of your mind and had full conversations with his own hand. And for a brief moment, the company actually treated him like he was a big deal. He even closed the very first episode of Monday Night Raw, but the whole thing fell apart the moment the bell rang. Damien was played by a guy named Philip Thies, a man who'd wrestled on the independent circuit as Mondo Clean. He was a big, fur-covered bruiser with a wild and very unique look, and that's what caught Vince's attention. There was also a sense backstage that Thies was a bit of an oddball, so he gave him a gimmick that leaned straight into it. It wasn't exactly a subtle gimmick, as he rambled nonsense and acted like he was hearing voices, but the WWF wasn't exactly known for its nuanced characters. Demento made his TV debut at the end of 1992 and picked up a couple of wins, but everything went downhill pretty quickly from there. He got beat by The Undertaker on the debut episode of Raw, and that's about all he's ever been remembered for. Max Moon was a gimmick so ambitious and so expensive that it burned through 2 wrestlers, cost a small fortune, and still never got past the undercard. It wasn't just a bad idea, it was a bad idea with a 5-figure bill attached to it. The concept was a futuristic superhero from outer space. On paper, it was a merchandise-moving character that the kids were going to love, but in reality, it looked like something from a cheap 50s sci-fi movie. It all started with Conan, who came up with the gimmick after seeing a robot on Japanese TV that could shoot fire and confetti. He pitched it to Vince, who obviously loved it, and suddenly the company was spending somewhere between $13,000 and $15,000 building this ridiculous suit. But the problems were immediately apparent. The suit was heavy and fragile, and hilariously, his jetpack didn't work properly. Honestly, the whole costume was ridiculous, and even a Hollywood studio would have struggled to make it look convincing. And because the suit was so bulky, it didn't go in a normal kit bag, so it had to be transported in 5 giant crates. Conan didn't expect to be the one having to drag it through the spaceport, the airport, so that soon started to piss him off. Plus he was getting backstage heat from the boys who were jealous that Vince was paying so much attention to him, and soon he had enough. After a few weeks he walked out and went back to Mexico, where he was making real money, and he left the WWF with a very expensive problem. Vince wasn't about to put a 15 grand costume in the bin, so the gimmick got handed to Paul Diamond, not because he fit the character, but because he literally fit the suit. he was just the right height and shape to be able to wear it. Max Moon's big moment came on the first episode of Monday Night Raw. He spacewalked down to the ring to wrestle Shawn Michaels for the Intercontinental title, and he ended up losing clean. From there, he slid straight into jobber territory, losing to guys like Skinner and Rick Martel before vanishing completely. Vince must have come to his senses and decided to abort the mission. Although I'd love to know what they did with that outfit. Maybe they blasted it into outer space.